everybody. I'm Howard Hitt, and today we're going to have a lecture, and I'd like to introduce you to Troy Morris. He'll take it over from here.
Thanks, Howard, and thanks, Larry, for having me talk with you guys about cannabis and some of the approaches that we're taking with trying to achieve an evidence-based medicinal and evidence-based outcomes with cannabis to create a intentional therapy that could benefit people. So, like Howard said, I'm Troy Morris, and I started a research project in about 2009 and was kind of asking some questions around cannabis. I didn't necessarily have a background in cannabis so much as I was a background in chemical engineering and organic synthetic chemistry, and started life as kind of a bench chemist looking at maybe crafting a intelligent or rational drug to address HIV. And then ultimately did a bunch of other things and worked in consulting and all kinds of things for chemical processes and critical processes, and found myself talking with a really nice lady whose physician was treating her poorly. And I was on a project trying to find doctors that overprescribe. And serendipitously, there was a crossover. And because of that, I saw somebody who was, in my opinion, clearly not a drug dealing Pablo Escobar, and more like a really nice Nana who had been given drug-seeking behavior for asking about cannabis from a physician that I was aware of, that maybe wasn't the best at not overprescribing. And so we did some research on cannabis to find out that there was about 32 times the research on cannabis than there was of any single popular drug that was being prescribed, which was kind of counter to what everybody was saying, is that there was no research done on cannabis, and that there was 32 times that research of any drug, like I say, in the repository of PubMed. So that was kind of perplexing, but I summarized that data with a friend of mine who was a computer programmer and kind of do a rough summary of expectations around cannabis as a therapeutic, and then pass that back to her under the guise of a kind of a worksheet. And that worksheet was apparently used with her physicians to try to communicate why she was seeking relief or some sort of medicinal benefit from cannabis. That worksheet went around the world in about 4 days. I think I made her on a Tuesday. She used it Thursday. Following Monday, I was being contacted by a group out of California asking if I had been working with a physician for the last 4 years. And so I explained to them that no, I just made this worksheet a few days prior, and that they had got it from a group in Israel. And so pretty crazy. Oregon's not a huge place. That's where I'm from. And I'd gone through some group up at OHSU, our research hospital, as information. And she had related that they kind of have collectively concluded that, and to their surprise, that there was more than one high around cannabis. And so that just led to stories amongst my friends. I had businesses in a town called Corvallis, Oregon, and just letting them know, geez, there was this thing that happened and pretty weird. And then those people started saying, hey, I know people that are in the medical marijuana program. They could use this worksheet with their doctor. So I started printing that out, and ultimately just kept printing it out, and people were coming in and some physicians. And eventually I found myself, I guess the only way to describe it is security for a lady talking to her doctor about cannabis. And so as I stood there just to have her doctor take her seriously, he asked if cannabis was going to be functional, then he would do the assessment and he was going to sign our card. And great. So I put my foot in my mouth at that time. I'm slowly learning to stop doing that, and real slowly. And so I told her, well, you have what is considered to be fibromyalgia. That's your diagnosis. I know someone who's used to have fibromyalgia, maybe still does, but it's under control. Let's go talk to her. That family is extremely conservative, especially when it would come to regards to drugs of any kind. So I don't believe that she'd be lying to me for, for no reason. And so I definitely trusted what she had to say. And I knew that her fibromyalgia issues were significant. So she totally agreed to see us. And what was even more amazing is that the nephew that was growing for her gave this patient that I was walking around with my foot in my mouth with, an entire ounce plus of weed. And back in the day, that was a lot. And so great, now we've got this person who's got the solution, and this person is unbelievably generous, and it's gonna be great. As it turns out, nope, it did not help her at all. She just got really high and had fibromyalgia, which made it worse for her. She didn't like being high, didn't like fibromyalgia, and now I was kind of on the hook because I suggested that I knew somebody that we could talk to, and maybe they could help us. And since it didn't, and it wasn't because of them not being generous and kind, but it was just simply because, for a reason that I didn't understand at the time, that she didn't get better. And so from there, I just started to try to figure it out. And what I basically started to learn is, from the illicit markets, which is the recreational market today, the basis and the beliefs and the metrics or the descriptors or whatever you want to call it. But if you were to take pretty much all of that information and put it on a big table, like I say, that's the part that's wrong, which is quite a bit, because kind of suggests all of it is wrong. And I think that is pretty clearly reflected in the big marijuana's results. The legalization of marijuana has left a medicinal aspect and model of trying to create something, even though it's random. There's a feedback process whether or not you keep it, and there's an iterative aspect, even though there's maybe not a rational approach to the decisions that ultimately are tied to medicinal effect. There is a rational aspect of, I'm going to change or I'm going to keep something because it either is working for my patient or it isn't. It doesn't exist necessarily in the recreational markets because effects and results have been usurped by percent THC, percent CBD. So our project was only driven by whether or not it worked. We didn't produce any of the cannabis. We were trying to understand the cannabis that was being produced in the Oregon medical program. That cannabis was selected and cultivated, cured, and delivered in a methodology that was often tied to, despite bad actors, but it was often tied to results. And even some of the bad actors ultimately had an aunt or mom or daughter or somebody that they cared about. And so even if they were considered, a bad person, the law-wise, even though the law was dumb, but the law still had a legalityness to it, didn't result in a cannabis being kept if it couldn't be sold on the illegal market and help the patient, or maybe some version of more one way, more the other way. But the diversity within the cannabis gave it its power. Now there's a bunch of colloquial, or I don't know what you want to call it, but a bunch of words like ratios and entourage. And ultimately, the most important thing I think to understand about that is that it's all not true. It doesn't work like an entourage effect, even though that's very popular to explain. It doesn't have to do with a CBD or THC ratio. Those are very easy to detect. So it's kind of like looking at the color of the car and saying, oh, well, that's definitely red. Well, it doesn't tell you anything else about the functionality of the car. Somebody would come by and say, oh, by the way, that's more expensive to insure. I don't know if that's true either. But the fact is there's still this mechanism of action, which is the cannabis plant and its conversion of its resources into the cannabinoids, which is the word for medicinal molecules within the cannabis plant, that talk to a very specific receptor system in the body. And that body also produces cannabinoids. They're called endocannabinoids in this case. When they're from the plant, obviously phyto means from the plant, it's PHYTO. And we produce 6. There's 413 in the plant, but there's 6 in the body. And some of them have a direct relationship between the two. But it's this interaction and synergy between the supplementation and the addenduming of the endo or human-based cannabinoids that the plant is able to do. It's not a one-to-one relationship. It's not this one is both produced in both places. In fact, we have some visuals to help people understand. They're very different. So if we were to lay them out in front of somebody, most people probably would not guess that they are the same class of chemical or therapeutic. You would look at them and say they're very different. Because if I were to show you a ball of twine, and then I were to show you a long snake, you would not conclude that they're the same. But the human cannabinoid coils around itself to create and simulate those knots or those rings. And so when it does that, it can function as a cannabinoid. Interestingly enough, the plant almost produces what the body intends the cannabinoid to do, which is interesting. And there's a whole bunch of ideas around how plants co-evolve and are selected and all this kind of stuff, whether it's the plant doing it or the humans doing it. The plant story is very beautiful. I don't necessarily believe it, but it's, there's a really great book about how plants tell us to keep them around. And it's definitely a cool story. I don't know how real it is, but regardless, we kept it around and we facilitated it forward. So there's a lot to what we do. Today, we're going to be talking a little bit mostly about the clinical aspects of it. I kind of try to put up the first slide of everything that we do to just set a context